Welcome to another episode of One Idea Away, where we're committed to living more fully, deeply, and consciously. Why? Because when we do, we're calmer, we're clearer, we're more connected, more joyful, and much more alive. On this show, we bring you stories of those that are figuring it out just like us, as well as experts who can shed light on the hows and the whys all of this stuff works. So I want to thank you all for tuning in and sharing and reviewing our show. If you haven't done so yet, please drop us a review. Also, subscribe to the podcast on our feed, whether it's on iTunes or whatever app you happen to be using. And if there's something that stands out in the show, do us a favor. If it makes you think of somebody, share it along, because this show is meant to get the conversation started, not just to drop in for a little inspiration. So with that, let's turn to this week's episode. Today's episode is sponsored by, well, us, One Idea Away, and very specifically by the 10 Days to Connection Challenge. You see, we ran this really interesting experience for our community in a slightly smaller way to bring people into greater connection with themselves, to clear away the mental clutter, to detox their hearts so they could be more open and free with the experience of life that they were having. And it went amazing. We received such incredible feedback about how wonderful this process was and how freeing it was for people to really connect to life in a deeper way and move past all the stress and the chatter and all the things that distract us on a day-to-day type of basis that ultimately disconnect us from who we truly are and the life that we love. And so this 10 Days Connection Challenge is meant to help you clear that clutter, that mental chatter that keeps you from connecting to that happier life. It helps you to create the space that you deserve to simply take a breath, to uncover what makes you happy, and to let go of anything that isn't working. You get to detox your mind, detox your heart, and connect to that life that you wish to experience, and learn how to bring it out more in you and in everything that you experience on a day in and day out basis. It's just 5 to 10 minutes a day for a week and a half, and it's one of the most beneficial things you can do for yourself to create that space that you need to connect to the life that's waiting for you. Just go over to oneideaway.com/connect. That's oneideaway.com/connect. And I look forward to joining you there. So our idea today, it has to do with stories, with storytelling and the power for both the listener as well as the teller. You see, there's something that has just absolutely always fascinated me about stories. For those who have listened for a while, you are likely aware of two things. I read a ridiculous amount of books, and I can share with you that I do very much prefer those that are told through story, whether it be a memoir, a narrative, something that's even personally conversational. Please give that to me over the dry how-to nonfiction book any day of the week. And if you've also listened for a while, you know that I love movies. And I'm talking not just good movies. I mean bad movies too, and happy movies, and sad movies, and epics, whatever. I'm a child of the 80s. It's just kind of the cross we bear, right? But I love the movie experience. And what all of these are really truly about is connecting to the story, to the journey that they're going on, the characters that are there, the experiences that are there. And these teach me so much more and is so much more memorable than the 27 ways to be happy or the 88th habit of the rich and famous, whatever it happens to be. And so when my guest today came onto my radar screen, I was absolutely intrigued. You see, he's a storyteller. And yes, he has a very unique background in life story, but he has just as many stories that have nothing to do with any of the craziness in the background. You see, there's something truly engaging about the way he tells stories and about the everyday stories that he shares as well. And he wrote about this process and several of those great stories in his book, Storyworthy. But before I get into that full introduction, let me have you ponder a question as you sit out there listening wherever you happen to be today. And it's where we're going to actually begin this conversation in just a moment. What is it about telling a story that feels so good? What is it that is really underneath why stories are so important to us that we want to share them? We're going to pick up with those questions and thoughts in just a moment. Our guest today is Matthew Dix. He's the international best-selling author of the novels Memoirs of an Imaginary Friend and Others, including the recently released Storyworthy, Engage, Teach, Persuade, and Change Your Life Through the Power of Storytelling. His novels have been translated into more than 25 languages worldwide. When he's not hunched over a computer screen, Matthew fills his days as an elementary school teacher, a storyteller, a speaking coach, a blogger, podcaster, wedding DJ, minister, life coach, and a Lord of Sealand. He has been teaching for 20 years and is a former West Hartford Teacher of the Year and a finalist for Connecticut Teacher of the Year. As I said, he's a creator and producer, also the co-host of Speak Up Storytelling, which is a podcast, as well as an event network that he's tied to called Speak Up as well. And so with that, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us here on One Idea Away.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. That was a wonderful introduction.
Excellent. Excellent. So listen, I know that people have shared for years, for decades, for centuries even, just how much human beings love to learn through stories. But there's a slightly different perspective that I wanted to ask you about, because most of what we hear about is how we love hearing stories and learning through stories. We don't always hear about the perspective of the storyteller. And I'm just wondering if you can maybe begin with, why do you think it's important to the storyteller to be able to tell the stories and share the stories that they share?
Yeah, I think that what happens is we go through our lives sort of carrying a lot of baggage. I think our stories oftentimes feel that way. If we're not really thinking of them in terms of things we can tell people and share with people and, open spaces of vulnerability and authenticity, they just start to feel like, weights on our shoulders that we drag through our lives. And so as a storyteller, one of the things I'm able to do, I've had an unusual life filled with a lot of sort of traumatic events. And I've discovered that through storytelling, I can take something really terrible that happened to me, and rather than just allowing it to exist within me, I turn it into a story. I tell that story. I make art and craft out of it. I make it something productive and useful for me, maybe something useful for other human beings as well. And then I can sort of put that down. I can take that traumatic event and put it down and say, well, that's a story now. And I can take that to the stage or take it to a dinner with someone or take it to a classroom. But it doesn't have to sort of weigh on me anymore. And I've made something better of it. So I think that that's the value that I feel when I'm telling stories.
It's interesting because there's the part of it that is sort of what you describe as sense making, right? So there's the part of it that helps us make sense of our lives and meaning of our lives. There's the part of it that is also us being able to move through, to process through whatever that experience happened to have been for us as well. And then there's the part of it, which I think is interesting in terms of the vulnerability. And I think you even went into a little bit in the book of why storytelling has been so important to you. And you just alluded to some of it, that it allows us to be seen. It allows us to be heard, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really believe that a lot of people in this world feel sort of invisible. When I teach storytelling, so many people tell me that until they began thinking about their lives through story, they didn't feel like very interesting people. And they sort of viewed their days as ordinary. Every day is just like the other. But when you start to develop this lens for seeing stories and understanding the import that actually exists in our lives, things change entirely in terms of your perspective and how you feel about who you are in this world.
That's interesting because I do want to get to a little bit of the backstory of how you got here, but we're kind of onto something that I want to stick with for a moment. This idea that I think you're right, that there's moments where we feel invisible, and there's also moments where we feel like, oh, well, it's just ordinary. I can't tell stories. My life is ordinary. Nothing extraordinary happens to me. I didn't have that trauma. I didn't jump that tall building, right?
Right.
So what is it that you've sort of learned to do, like even beyond the bigger stories in your background? What is it that you've learned to do? And I think you've even referred to it as these 5 seconds of meaning. What is it that you're seeing that other people aren't seeing?
Well, I mean, through some exercises and a process that I engage in, I've just discovered that we have moments of sort of transformation or realization, moments where we change in some oftentimes infinitesimal but fundamental way. And that those are the best stories to tell. Like, twice in my life, I have died and been brought back to life by paramedics. But it turns out those are really hard stories to tell because I can't connect with people on a going through a windshield and dying on the side of the road level. Like, people just don't experience that. But what they love is little moments that we have where we discover something new about ourselves, or someone says something to us that makes us look at the world in a new way. And it doesn't always have to be positive. It can be, I used to think I was a good human being, but I've discovered I'm pretty selfish and I have a lot of work to do. People, that resonates with people in a way that sort of going through the windshield and dying on the side of the road will never resonate with people. And so our lives are filled with these moments. We see them sometimes. If we do see them, what we do is we end up tossing them away like trash. We don't recognize them and use them for anything. And so I've just figured out a way to see those moments and understand their import.
It's interesting because I've referred to moments like this in kind of my own life and clients that I've had the pleasure of working with and things like that as these meaningful moments. And these meaningful moments, they happen all the time. And to exactly what you just said, we don't see them for what they are. Maybe because we're not thinking about how we want that to transform us or how we may want to share that one day or what have you. And instead we just kind of let it go. Yeah. And we're letting go these not just nuggets of wisdom, but these are the things that make life worth living, right? It's those moments where we touch life in a completely different way.
Right. We really are just the sum of our experiences. You know, I mean, there are people who believe they're the sum of the things that they purchase and fill their homes with. But, you know, when it comes right down to it, when you are lying on your deathbed and looking back on your life, the things you own are meaningless. And it will be the memories that you had that will be the most important things you own. And I just think we toss those memories aside and just ask someone who has a kid, you know, and say, you know, oh, your kid's 11. You know, how quickly did that time go by? And a lot of times I tell people it doesn't need to go by that quickly if you just opened your eyes and paid attention and took note of these things. Because the more you remember, the slower time goes by. If you can remember 150 beautiful moments from your child's 8th year of life, that year's going to feel a lot longer than someone who remembers 5 moments. And so taking note of those things slows down time, increases your enjoyment of life and your understanding of what your life is.
That is an absolutely wonderful perspective. And because now, as soon as you mentioned that idea that the more that we remember, the more that time seems to slow down, I'm playing stuff down in my head already. And it is. I mean, you think about, and I know that you do this on a daily, and I don't want to get to the practices yet, but when we are able to kind of look whether they're day or our week, our month, our experience with certain relationships, and be able to recall the different moments in time and experiences that we had, and not just the really, really big, shiny stuff, but the usual, the everyday, the stuff at the kitchen table, the stuff in the living room or the family room or the classroom or what have you. It really does. It literally helps us know how full our life is by being able to recount all that.
Right. All you have to do is ask someone, what'd you do last Thursday? We lose last Thursday all the time.
Right.
You know, so many last Thursdays are now lost to us forever. And I just fundamentally believe that every day contains something that makes that day different than any other. And I believe that most days contain more than one of those things. And when we start to notice them, when we start to acknowledge them, talk about them, and record them, time slows down in an amazing way. And your life is just more full because of it.
So let's give a glimpse of a little background here. You've mentioned deathbed before. How does somebody go from nearly dying twice before the age of 18? You've been a McDonald's manager who's been held at gunpoint. You've been homeless. And now you're a 5th grade teacher. You own a DJ. You do podcasting. You do storytelling. You have a storytelling network. That's an interesting little transition to go through. So I'm just kind of curious of maybe here's the question I wanted to ask was, what was it that opened you up to the path that you're now on? And I know it's never just one thing. It's usually a sequence of things. But what was it that took you from the experience of life that you were going through and all of these incredible, crazy, and traumatic things you were going through that then opened you up to things can be really, really, really different?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I guess it was one moment. I had dreams all my childhood, but I grew up poor. You know, I got kicked out of my house when I was 18, so I just didn't think I was going to have much of a future. And, you know, it was a midnight on the floor of a McDonald's restaurant with a gun to my head. And, you know, a man told me he was going to pull the trigger and kill me if I didn't open this portion of a safe that I couldn't open. It was one of those, the manager has the key and I don't have the key. And, you know, he counted back from 3. And it was a moment when I had died oddly twice before this, you know, but both of those times I didn't really know I was dying and coming back to life. Both times I closed my eyes and I woke up with paramedics all over me, you know, so it wasn't really a moment for me, oddly. But the time the man told me he was going to shoot me in the head and I fundamentally believed he was going to shoot me in the head, I just had an enormous sense of regret that I was 22 years old and I had accomplished nothing and I was going to die and be forgotten. And ever since that moment, and the gun wasn't loaded, so he pulled the trigger. The gun wasn't loaded. I mean, unfortunately, it results 2 decades of PTSD, and I mean, it's forever probably. But but ever since then, I've been relentless. I live in constant fear that I will have another moment where I am about to die, and I will have regret for not having done everything I wanted to do. Yeah. And so I became relentless after that moment, and I've been that way ever since.
What was some of that progression? I mean, you go through something as traumatic and as altering as an experience like that. You have some of the insight that you now have. You have a different drive with some of the other trauma that does actually come along with that as well. But I also know that that's usually not just like a snap your fingers, life is now different, this is who I am. It's usually a process of progression of some kind. What did that look like? Like, what did the journey of those next, 6, 8, 10 years ultimately look like for you?
What happened is I decided, or I came to the understanding that nothing is as hard as we think it is. And so, I was facing trial at the time for a crime I didn't commit, oddly.
I left that one out of your intro too.
So a few months after that, I ended up on trial and I was found not guilty. And the moment I was found not guilty, I was sort of free again in my life to make choices on my own. And I immediately went to college. And I don't know how I did it, truly, except that I believe nothing's as hard as we think it is. But I went to school full time and I managed a restaurant full time, a McDonald's restaurant. So, 45 hours a week working at a McDonald's and going to college full time, and then ended up becoming the vice president of my school and working in the writing center. Today, I don't know how I had the energy, as a 47-year-old man looking back at my 27-year-old self. I think I don't know how you did it, except I know that I had to do it. And that really, it's just one step at a time. People look at problems or look at sort of goals as these enormous, impossible hills to climb. And I've discovered that all of those hills are just one step after another step. And if I just focus on the next step, one day I get to the top of the hill. And I just think people look up the hill and they think I can never get up there. And I say, well, can you get one step? And I just take one step every day.
What was it then that finally got you on the stage? And let me just, as background. So you run an organization called Speak Up, which is part of a storytelling network. Your original appearance and some of the things that brought this out of you was getting on on the stage of a wonderful organization called The Moth, which is a great storytelling organization that people should also check out. And that was like your first talk, right? First public talk was getting on the stage of The Moth.
Yeah. My friends told me they started hearing the Moth's podcast.
Okay.
And you have to go to New York and tell a story because you have the worst life of anyone we know. You're going to be amazing. And that was a mistake. That was not true because it turns out most of the stories I tell don't have anything to do with the things that, the big things that happen. They're all the small things. But I told them, yes, I'll go to the Moth and I'll tell a story with no intention of ever doing so. I did not want to go to New York and face hipsters with, man buns and side eye and, irony. I just didn't think I could do it. But it was one of those moments where you say you're going to do something, and I got stuck having to do it because I said I would. And so in 2011, my wife got us tickets, and I said, I'm going to tell one story, and I'm never going to do it again. And, it'll be a checkbox off my life. And we went, and there's 20 names about in a bag on any night. They throw 20 names in the bag. 10 names get picked out to tell a story. Threw my name in and just prayed that my name would not come out of that bag. And my name came out 10th, and I couldn't believe it. First, I didn't move, actually. They called my name, and I just stayed frozen because it occurred to me no one in the room knew who I was. So I figured I can just sit here quietly, and eventually they'll move on to someone else. But I had brought my terrible wife with me and kicked me under the table and said, that's your name. You need to go tell your story. And I hated every moment of that night until I started speaking into the microphone, and something just happened. The first word I remember out of my mouth into that microphone, I felt like I had found a place I belonged. And one and done became a career. Now I travel the world telling stories. So it's remarkable.
I'm curious, what was that first story you told?
It was a story about how I learned to pole vault in high school. And it was a story about how I was rooting against one of my teammates to fail so that my teammates would perceive me as the better pole vaulter. It's the idea that sometimes in team sports, you actually root against your teammates because you want to be the best on the team. You don't really care about the team success. And I've always discovered that whenever I can get on a stage and talk about the worst parts of me, whether it's currently the worst part of me or the worst part of me in the past, those are the stories people love the most because those are the stories people are afraid to talk about.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of the beauty. Well, two things. One is I think it's part of the beauty of the stories that you have told more often now are those parts of you and the things that everybody can relate to, as opposed to the extraordinary, overcoming or triumphant or traumatic type stories, which are very difficult for people to relate to. They can be very inspiring, but very difficult for people to relate to. And as part of that, being able to touch on those, there's something about story that allows us to access parts of ourselves that we're not sure we want to be seen. But if somebody else does it and allows it to be seen, now we're a little bit more willing to either go there for ourselves or even begin to share it and, wow, actually talk about it.
Yeah.
And that opens us up to something totally different, a totally different experience of life.
I carry so many people's secrets because I share a story on stage. And I mean, the craziest thing that's ever happened to me is 4 times in my storytelling career, I have stepped off a stage and been approached by a woman who told me the story of her miscarriage. And in all 4 cases, I was the one and only person she had ever spoken to about it. Wow. And the first time it happened, I just thought it was crazy. I called my wife right after the show. She had a miscarriage. And I said to her, like, that's crazy, isn't it? And she said, it's not crazy. Like, you made yourself vulnerable. You spoke about something most people don't speak about. And she also pointed out it's important that I was a stranger, because sometimes it's hard to share our secrets with, like, the person we share a cubicle with, because the next day we have to face them again. Yeah. And so I became a safe person to carry their secret into the world, and they could unburden themselves. So you can't believe the things that people tell me after I tell a story on a stage.
Yeah. And what an honor that is for people to be able to open up and to be able to share that with you, to be able to allow you to carry that forward. Right. One of the other things that you share in the book, and then there's a couple of things. One of which, though, is this question and issue of doubt that comes up. Oh, yeah. And you related it initially in terms of people that have actually doubted some of the stories that you have told. And I'm just kind of curious if you could share a little bit about that, and how do you wrestle with that? How do you work through the issues of your own doubt, as well as people maybe doubting some of the stuff that you've shared?
Yeah, it's the worst. I mean, I think it's happened to me 5 times in my life where someone's come up to me and said, I don't really think that happened. Mm-hmm. And I remember each time explicitly because it was so painful to me. It's very hard to get up on a stage in front of 1,000 people and share something vulnerable and true and then have a person just doubt it. It's worse because you don't think it's just that person. As soon as that person says, I don't think that happened, you can't help but wonder who else in the room is doubting this truth, because it just takes courage and guts to do it. And then for someone to just throw it in your face is a rotten thing. Yeah. So I always push back on it. I've had those feelings too. I was at a moth slam last night and I heard a story and I thought in my head, I don't think that happened. But I would never go up to that human being and say, I don't think it happened, because I just don't know. And I know how painful that can be. There's no purpose in telling someone you don't believe their story. Walk out quietly and talk about it in the car, but don't tell the person. So it's something I wrestle with. It's honestly something I try to push back and not think about. Because every time one of those experiences pops up into my mind, it's just so painful. I can't stand it. I'm a novelist as well. So if I wanted to make up stories, I work in fiction all the time. Like, it almost seems too easy to make up stories because I could just make up anything. I love storytelling because I have a certain set of facts that I'm burdened with. And I have to craft those facts, choosing which ones to use and which ones to not use and what order to tell them in and how to tell them. I love that puzzle-making process of storytelling. I don't know why anyone would ever make up a story. Yeah.
Well, and I think even in today's times, we're seeing that reality is often very stranger than some of the fiction we can come up with. So we might as well play with it. So one of the other things, and I wanted to ask you to tell one particular story, and there's a handful that I've heard you tell. I've heard you talk about your son and his Olympic ability to throw peas. I've heard you push children down slides. So really wonderful, very uplifting stuff. No, but I was hoping you could share one of those with us so that we could talk a little bit about how we do elicit, how we do start to see and pull forward some of the experiences of our life and see the deeper story that's there.
Right. I mean, I guess I'll tell you, though, I was at the Moth last night and I told a brand new story.
Great.
It's one of those stories that feels big, but it's not. A police officer called me one day as I was stepping out of the shower. I was naked and wet, as I say. And I looked at the phone, and it was an unknown number, which is crazy. I would never normally answer these phone calls, if it doesn't list someone. But for some reason, I answered it. And it was a police officer who told me that my wife, my daughter, and my son were in the back of an ambulance. My daughter was having an allergic reaction to peanuts, and they were heading to the hospital. And he told me, stay calm. Everything's fine. Just go to the hospital, drive slowly. And I thought, everything's fine. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. nothing is fine in the world ever again now because my daughter is having an allergic reaction to peanuts. And so I threw clothes on over a wet body and I jumped in the car, and it's a 15-minute ride that I did in 7 minutes. And when I got there, I beat the ambulance there because they were treating them on the scene and I didn't know it. So I sort of created a scene in the emergency room. I started yelling at the nurse, telling her, no, you don't understand. I was naked and wet when the phone call came in. So I have to, like, the ambulance has to be there. There's no way I beat it. And, she told me I'm going to have a police officer, move you aside, sir. But the words she said to me, she said, there's nothing you can do, so go sit down. And I sat down, in the waiting room because I didn't want the police officer to, involve himself with my life. But I remember her saying there was nothing I can do. And it's sort of a moment in my life that I realized that my daughter was 3 at the time, that she had her own life already. That all these times when she would come home and she'd say, I love Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I would say, how do you know who Ruth Bader Ginsburg is? I was supposed to be the one to teach you about her, and she learned how to use like Netflix before I could figure out how to like negotiate the Netflix like screens. Like, it was a moment that sort of solidified the idea that she has her own life and she's on her own path. And as much as I like to think I'm on that path with her, I'm not always on that path. And so I sat in that waiting room just thinking, like praying that when she needs help and I'm not on the path with her, that someone else will be on that path to take care of her when I can't be. It was sort of the moment you realize as a father, like, damn it, I can't take care of my daughter at all times. Yeah. And so that's what the story is about. It's not really about chasing down an ambulance and getting a phone call while you're naked and wet out of the shower. It's really a moment that most parents, I think, have to come to terms with, that their children have their own lives and we can't control them. Because for a long time we can. Until my daughter's like 2, I basically have control over all the information she receives, all the food she eats. I control every aspect of her life. But then she goes and does this awful thing. She becomes a human being of her own. And so that's what the story was that I told last night. And again, it's a small story that connects to a lot of adults. And, when it sounds like a big thing because it involves ambulance rides and police officers and phone calls, but that's essentially the heart of the story. And that's what I try to get to.
Wow. Now, for something like that, how do you begin to see clearly? I mean, I hear it now, so I know that you've had the chance to reflect on it. I know that you've thought about how is it that I convey this message and the experience that I've had. And I guess the piece that I want to be able to share with everybody that's out there is, how do we recognize the depth of those moments? Because I'm sure what you just articulated was not the way you would have articulated it that day. You've had the chance to say, this is okay, and this is how I would say this now. This is how to explain this. Right. So how do you get that clarity? How do you get the clarity within those experiences to say, yeah, this is really what that held for me, and this is what I'd love to be able to share with others?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to do it, or a few ways. Sometimes you just know that you had a moment and you're not quite sure what it is. I mean, I know when I was sitting in that waiting room that like something fundamentally changed in me. And that day, you're right, I probably couldn't tell you what it was. Sometimes what happens is we just tell ourselves the story. And as we tell ourselves the story out loud, I believe we have to say it out loud so we can hear it. We get to a moment and we go, oh God, that's what it is. That's what that moment was for me. Sometimes the question that I ask myself most often is, why do you do the things you do? I say that to myself all the time. My father and I write letters to each other, for example. I don't know my father very well. He disappeared from my life when I was 7, and we've been in and out of each other's lives a little bit. But the way I've figured out to communicate with him is to write physical letters back and forth. And one day my wife asked me, what did your father's last letter say? And I said, oh, I'll let you read it sometime, which was kind of not true. What I really should have said was, I haven't opened it yet, but I didn't want to tell her that. And I didn't know why. So I said to myself, I realized, wow, I kind of just lied to my wife a little bit. And I don't do that. So I said, why do you do the things you do? Why don't you open your father's letter until a new letter comes? So I always have one unopened letter. And then I realized, oh, my father left me when he was 7, when I was 7. And if I keep an unopened letter from my father, he can't really ever leave me again because I always have something from him that I don't know yet.
Wow.
And so I'm always waiting for the next letter before I open the last letter. And I haven't told that story, but that was something I recently discovered by just asking myself, why do you do the things you do? So often in life, we sort of wander around the world doing odd things. things that we're not really cognizant of on sort of a frontal lobe level.
Yeah.
And so I'm just always asking myself that question. I'm asking myself, why does this mean something to me? Why am I doing this odd thing? Why do I keep returning to this moment in my life? There must be something there. And then oftentimes I tell myself the story, and that's how I find the moment.
That's fantastic.
Sometimes you just know it too. Sometimes you just,
Sure. So, sometimes they are. And I think it's more, and the reason for my asking in that why do you do the things you do is a great way of bringing attention to it, is for those that imagine their lives to be ordinary, that imagine they don't have the story to tell, or there isn't the meaning that's there.
Right.
It is to be able to begin to say, wait. I promise you, there is more than you could ever possibly imagine. There's
true.
so much
It's
there.
so true. Yes.
So what's one of, because that's a wonderful question to be able to walk around with. And I know that you shared one of your daily practices actually in the book. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit of that here, of being able to reflect at the end of your day on what's occurred.
Yes. So I call it homework for life. It's a homework assignment I give to people for the rest of their lives. It's simple. At the end of every day, now I do it during the day, but it started as at the end of every day, I sit down and I ask myself, what's the most story-worthy moment from my day? Even if that moment is not truly story-worthy, even if it's boring, benign, I would never even bother to tell my wife about it. I'm looking for the moment that makes that day different than any other day. And when I find it, I write it down. I don't write the whole story down because I just don't believe in long, complex habits. Those aren't habits. Those are journalers, special people who journal every day, and, they're a rare breed, and I am not one of them. So I use a spreadsheet. The left, the A column of the spreadsheet has the date, and the B column I stretch to the end of my computer screen. And in that B column, that's all I allow myself. I write what happened that day, just enough to get me back to that moment later on. So for Clara in that ambulance moment, I would have written, Clara goes to the hospital in an ambulance with my wife and Charlie, my son. I beat the ambulance there, yell at nurse. She tells me to sit down. I realize, damn it, Clara has her own life and I can't control it anymore. That's all I would write.
Okay.
But I could get back to it now. Now it's stuck in my memory. I've sort of reflected on it, which causes it to just remain in my mind a lot longer, maybe forever. And then over time, my goal was to find maybe one story every 2 or 3 months on top of what I already had to tell. But over time, what I discovered is we're full of stories. Like, you develop this lens for stories so that little moments suddenly gain so much importance because you didn't see it before. And then if you actually write it down and reflect upon it and then start telling stories about these moments, that's when your life gets really full. And people who do it, people who do homework for life, they will tell you that it is life-changing. I have people who don't ever plan on telling stories. They still do it because that level of introspection, that level of willingness to look at your day and find something of meaning, it's wonderful. It's different than like a gratitude journal because a lot of times we have experience in our lives that we're not very grateful for, but they're still meaningful. They still mean something to us. So it's just the idea that every day has something of import and we have to find it.
That's excellent. Before we kind of bring this round full circle and wrap ourselves up, what would you say has been the greatest surprise that you have received from doing this storytelling work that you do?
I think this most surprising thing is I thought I was going to start teaching storytelling to people who wanted to stand on stages and tell stories, and I do. But the people who have sort of come to me wanting to learn to tell stories, the variety is endless. I was on a Mohawk reservation in Canada earlier this year teaching Native Americans how to tell stories. I was at a retreat with 13 rabbis who were deemed boring by their congregations and sent to me in order to teach them to tell stories and to be more vulnerable with their congregations. I work with corporate leaders and nonprofits and grandparents who can't get grandchildren to listen to them. Always one person in my workshops who doesn't know why they're there. They say, my wife told me I had to come. I don't know why. And we quickly figure out why. I discovered they're one of the worst storytellers I've ever met, but I turn them into someone who's much better. I have yet to meet a person or a profession or even like a hobbyist that can't benefit through storytelling. And I would have never guessed that until they started coming to me and saying, I'm a priest, I need to learn how to tell stories. I'm a therapist, I need to learn how to tell stories. Whoever they are, I just always surprised in every workshop about the new reason why someone is learning from me.
It really is amazing that sometimes, from my own background, but what you just described, this really relates of we have our intention. We think we know where we're going. We think we know what this is for and who this is for and all of the whys, the wherefores, everything else. And we've seen it within the coach training program that IPEC, which is kind of the umbrella of One Idea Away. All of a sudden we'd look around the room and the people who were going into the program to become coaches was a much lower percentage than it used to be because of what you're describing. They see applications, they see uses, they see benefit from this in so many different ways. And that idea of storytelling, and I think you said it so well before, of it allows us to be vulnerable, it allows us to be seen, it fills up our lives so much more. We see so much more sense and meaning in everything that happens on even just that everyday level. And even that question or that thought of how is this day different than any other is another wonderful thing that's going to help us extract so much more from our days. I guess, Matthew, to wrap ourselves up, one of the things we do with One Idea Away is that we like to, foster the idea with everybody that this is the beginning of a conversation. This is the beginning of something that maybe they've heard, something that's been sparked. This is not the end of it. We like that conversation to continue. And I'm curious from your standpoint of what is your hope for the conversation that continues for anybody that's heard our conversation today, or even those that come into contact with your work? What's the conversation that you hope they continue from that point forward?
The thing I always tell people is, even more than telling stories, we have to provide space for people to tell their stories. If you become attuned to it, you'll hear people say things like, oh, that happened to me once, and they'll trail off. Because so often people have something to say, but they don't feel like they're being afforded the space or time to say it. And so I am a person who spends his life saying, oh, tell me that story. And so I hear stories all the time. And, there's some selfishness there too, because when I hear a story, I'm often reminded about something in my life that now I can share with them or on a stage. So I find stories that way as well. But I'm just constantly reminding myself that I am a straight, white, male American. I have plenty of space and time to tell stories. My life has been spent with space and time. But a lot of people, for whatever reason, and sometimes unfortunate reasons, they don't have that space, or they don't feel they have it, or they don't feel like anyone wants to listen. And so if we can just become people who open up spaces for stories, then I think that we're going to find stories ourselves, and we're going to be so much more gratified in hearing other people's stories. I always say you can't really hate someone when you know their story. You can still disagree with them. You can still fundamentally believe that they are wrong and even dangerous to whatever organization you're a part of. But once you know their story, it's really hard to dismiss them in a way that I think we dismiss people today. So opening up a space for stories is important.
I love that notion. I could not agree with you more. When we give space to somebody to be able to tell their story, we're going to connect to something about them. Like you said, whether we agree with them or not, there's something we're going to be able to connect to that makes it very hard for them to be perceived simply as some other than us. Yeah. And we need a lot of that right now. And so the idea that we could share some stories and maybe sit around and just have a beer over it or a glass of wine over it might be a starting point for a lot of people out there. Yeah. But Matthew, I want to thank you for the work that you're doing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's great. I mean, it would be great. That vision that you just proposed would be a beautiful thing.
Matthew, I want to thank you so much for being here on One Idea Way, and thank you for the work and the stories that you're sharing with the world.
Thank you so much.
For everybody out there, there's some great questions of why do you do the things that you do? How is this day different than any other? These are some really, really great questions for you to be able to reflect on. But I want to continue to just leave you with where Matthew did and the conversation to continue, which is make space for other people to tell their story. Maybe ask them, what about this day is different for you than from other days? And just see the story that they tell you. Allow them to pick through their everyday moments and to see what it is that they see and get to know them that way. I want to thank you, as always, for dropping in on One Idea Away. And until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Hey, as this episode is wrapping up, you may be asking yourself, what's next? Well, what's next? I hope that you've been joining in on the monthly live cast that we do for the One Idea Away community. You see, every single month, we gather some incredible guests that are talking about the types of transitions that they've made or are even in the midst of making to create a happier life, to create a life that's more aligned to who they truly are. So we're talking about happiness and purpose. We're talking about community. We're talking about how do we have that modern day success, meaning meaning how do we succeed in our happiness, our well-being, our quality of life, while also making a great living, making the difference in the contributions that we are each meant to make. So when you get involved in the monthly live cast, you can ask some questions of our guests. You can participate with some of the other community members and the ongoing chat that just seems to explode as we get into these deeper conversations throughout the whole hour that we do this. So the only way, though, that you can get these special episodes is when you register for them. It is free, but you got to register to get involved and continue the conversations we're always talking about. So just hop on over to oneideaaway.com/livecast. And oneideaaway.com/livecast. Join us there, get involved in the conversation, get involved in the community. I can't wait to continue the conversation with you. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you really enjoyed it, do me a favor, let us know. You can keep the conversation going and send us a message on our Facebook page, which is simply One Idea Away. Go ahead and tag me in the post or even just direct messages. Also, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this episode along with someone that you believe could benefit from hearing the ideas and the messages that we got into. That's pretty much why we do this. So you can just go ahead and share it from your app or email it along, whatever works for you. The point is to share, to talk, to discuss, and keep the dialogue going, because it's in those conversations that ideas can take hold and create profound shifts in perspective. That's what allows us to live life more fully, deeply, and consciously. As always, we would love to see you post a review for the podcast in iTunes or whichever app you're using. And until next time, remember, you're never more than one idea away from a whole new reality. This is Luke Iorio and One Idea Away, signing off.